What is Islamophobia and how do we address it? Today, I'm interviewing Imam El-Farouk Khaki. El-Farouk is a refugee and immigration lawyer, public speaker, and social commentator. His law practice represents people fleeing persecution because of sexuality, gender identity, political affiliation, and HIV status. He is the founder of Salam, Queer Muslim Community, a founding member of the Muslim Lawyers Association, founding member of Al Tawheed Juma Circle, and also co-founder of the Canadian Muslim Union and the Muslim AIDS Project. So he has been very busy. He has won numerous awards for his leadership and advocacy in human rights and social justice. And most important of all, he is a very proud father. And we have known each other for many, many years. El-Farouk, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here today.
So there are some things that the world's major religions have in common. And what do you see as some of the commonalities between Islam and Christianity?
I think the commonalities are many, and they're not just in the theology, but in our histories and our stories. And sometimes our stories are a little bit different, but they overlap. And of course, I'm referring to the stories of the prophets, and Islam acknowledges, celebrates, and makes its own the prophets named in the Bibles, as well as names others and acknowledges a global prophecy or prophethood as a global phenomena. But certainly, I think one of the most important things, or the two of the most important things, are Jesus and Mary. And we may look at them differently in our theologies, and I acknowledge there's no monolithic Christian way of looking at Jesus and Mary, and there is also no monolithic way of looking at Jesus and Mary in Islam or within the Quranic narrative, but that's what we share, I think, and there's a profound love from both parties. And I think for Christians and Muslims, if we both actually understood that love, and it's important in this context because Muslims are a minority within a larger Christian context in North America. And so understanding this foundation of love, as preachers, we always talk about love and the transformation that can be found in love. And so if we begin acknowledging that we both love these two figures in our histories, that might be a really good way to start with our commonalities.
Yep. That's a great answer, El-Farouk, and I deliberately asked it as the first question because I think when people think of Christianity and Islam, they begin to start looking at differences. And sometimes see some of the negative voices within both of our traditions and give those negative voices too much prominence, when the vast majority of both traditions can work together, have worked together with mutual respect over centuries. And
Yes.
so thank you for that answer. And I hope folks will really begin to think differently and look at commonalities first. So great. In Christianity, there is a fundamentalist, moderate, and progressive wing, and they view the Bible differently. Is this true with Islam regarding how they view the Quran?
There are as many ways to read the Quran as there are Muslims. I always say that we give life to text, but text also gives life to us, right? And the life that we give is the interpretive choice that we have. There have been many movements in Islamic history, in Muslim history, that have argued, debated different theological aspects. Whether you can categorize them as liberal or progressive or so on and so forth, I'm not quite sure that it can fit into those models. And some of those schools, for example, had very progressive views. So Ibn Hazm had very progressive views on some issues, including female prophethood. Speaking of Mary, but then may have had other views that were sort of regressive or that we wouldn't sort of necessarily agree with. Historically, I mean, I think we need to understand the context of Islam today, particularly within a colonial and post-colonial context, and oil. So the short answer is there is no formalized, or there are no formalized movements, but there have always been progressive voices and progressive movements in Islam, or movements that have had progressive elements in them. And I think what we're seeing now in the 21st century is more and more discourse about not just reforming or revisiting, but also reclaiming erased histories from our narratives. Histories that were erased because they were politically inconvenient, histories that were erased by colonialism and by racism, and histories that have been erased by oil money. And then by 9/11 and all the lobbies that have jockeyed us for their support, or for our support for their causes, whatever their causes may be. So short answer no, long answer yes.
So in terms of progressive voices within Christianity, would look at the Bible as a history book, would look at the Bible more metaphorically rather than factually. We look at the Bible less as a rule book and more as a guide. How would progressive Islam look at the Quran?
Well, I don't want to speak for all of progressive Islam because I've read stuff or I've heard stuff that I don't agree with. So I think there are certain historical trends even as to how to read the Quran. Now, in Sufism, there is a tradition that every verse of the Quran has 70,000 layers of meaning. Right? Now, whether it is 444 or 69,999 is not relevant. I think what this tradition is telling us is that the possibilities of interpretation are limitless. And that's what makes our books, and that's what makes the Quran a living and organic thing, is that it can be read according to the people, according to the time, and according to the place. The second you sort of freeze that down, in my opinion, and you try to regulate it or use political control. So, we talk about separation of church and state. Let's also talk about mosque and state, right? Bringing those two together is never a good thing in my opinion. It doesn't matter the religion or the political state. So if you look at this, at the Sufi understanding that every verse has so many potential interpretations, there are different ways. In certain Muslim traditions, there's a notion that parts of the Quran, that the whole Quran is eternal, but some specifics within the Quran refer to specifics that are historical and contextual. But that's a debate that continues to go on between different circles. And of course, we have the literalists who will see the Quran as being a literal document and that freezes culture and thought within a particular ethno-racial, cultural, historical paradigm, right? That's what fundamentalism is about. It's about, in my opinion, taking something that's alive and living and breathing and trying to being taxidermist with it, right? So the way people look at the Quran can be very different depending on who they are, where they are. A lot of people struggle, I think, today because dominant culture voices are quite literalist in some of the verses and so on and so forth. I think it's important when we're talking about this is also to look at cultural difference and historical difference that comes out of culture. And I think the Industrial Revolution in Europe is been one of the foundations of this interpretive thought and change in Christianity, or this creation of greater diversity within Christianity. Let's put it that way. The Industrial Revolution didn't take place in the geopolitical South. It was imposed on us with the human rights conditions that were imposed on Europe in the 18th century, or in the centuries of the first years of the Industrial Revolution. It's been imposed in the same way, but it's been brought in from outside. So those are all the kinds of things that sort of interfere, if you will, with the freedom of interpretive choice, I think. So
yeah, and very, very, very similar within Christianity. How would you define Islamophobia?
I wrestle with this word, right? Because on some level, I wonder whether it assumes that Islam is a monolith, and it also objurgates it interferes with the perception that real people are being harmed. is it more Islamophobia than it is Islam? And I understand that there's a fear of Islam, but it also translates very much into impacts on real people in society. And so it's not just a fear of Islam, it's the harm to Muslims, or to people who are perceived to be Muslim, right? So I was on a queer interfaith panel for Ryerson and Sardar, from the Sikh community as a queer Sikh. And Sikhs have been targeted in the wake of 9/11, because, well, ignorance knows no bounds, and Sikhs are often perceived to be Muslim, so they become the targets of that. So there's a real human impact on it, and I think sometimes Islamophobia as a term sort of obscures that sort of understanding. But for me, it's a fear of things Muslim, of a misunderstanding of what Islam is. But I think that, we're living in strange times, and we're seeing a particular face that dominates perceptions of Islam. And when you look at America, there's a particular Christianity that's dominating the narrative right now, and I'm not actually a fan of either.
No, absolutely. Christianity has some really awful periods in different parts of the world of horrendous activity. And it kind of shifts back sometimes to a more progressive face. But absolutely, in many parts of the world today, the more fundamentalist, literalist approach of Christianity is dominating. But I really appreciate your distinction between Islamophobia and fear of Muslims. I think that really is helpful. So how do you think other religions, what should we be doing to try to lessen that fear, the violence, the discrimination, the otherness?
I think all of our traditions talk about walking in the steps of the other, right? Judge not, lest ye be judged yourself. These kinds of articulations exist across religious traditions. One of the folks I really love and am inspired by is Cornel West, and bringing together the spirituality, the faith issues, but the human dignity and the social justice issues. And a quote of his, I think, summarizes a lot of our traditions, which is, "Justice is what love looks like in public." Right? So Christians talk about, or dominant culture Christianity talks about God as love. Dominant culture Islam will talk about justice. I think this quote tells us that there's really no difference between the two. That you cannot love without justice, and there can be no justice without love. I think if we all understood that, and if we understood the commonalities in our humanity, I saw the questions yesterday, and I was reflecting on our experiences, for example, with Bill 167, and how years and years ago, and how the majority of the Ontario population was against giving us equal rights. But people started to tell their narratives. People started coming out of their closets because it was necessary, and some people had the strength and the privilege to do that. And some people had nothing to lose by that time, because we're also in the coming through the AIDS crisis, and how families had been denied and ripped apart, and so on and so forth. When people started telling these stories, the attitude changed. The popular opinion changed, and we went from the majority of Ontarians not supporting equal rights for same-sex couples to the majority of Ontarians actually saying, yes, I support this. So I think sharing bread together, and so, for example, the Peace Iftar, which I started back with Guy, started back in 2002, was an example of bring people together to break bread. Know your neighbor, and in knowing your neighbor, hopefully you deconstruct your own fears and your own prejudices. Right? It's just a starting step, but I mean, I think doing that, sharing bread together. It's a bit difficult these days with COVID, but we can still do outdoor celebrations. Invite folks over for your Hanukkah, for your Diwali, for your Eid, for your Yule, for your solstice, for your Shabe Yalda, for your Christmas, for whatever. My household, we try to celebrate as much as we can, but there's a lot to do. Kwanzaa.
Yeah. I've been asking folks lately, religious leaders, a question about COVID, because one of the places of resistance to COVID is people who are saying for religious reasons. What would you say to religious leaders in the Christian tradition or the Muslim tradition when they say it's against their religion for people to get vaccinated?
Let me take a moment to laugh for a moment, but it's not funny. I understand, and people's lives are on this, depend on these kinds of answers. I don't understand. I come from Africa. If we didn't have vaccines, if we didn't have polio and other vaccines, millions of people would have died in decades gone past. So I don't understand it from a practical level. I understand there might be concerns around the process and the procedures by which the vaccines are released, or even what the contents of the vaccines are. That's all fair. That's all perfectly legitimate. In the Muslim tradition, I was just actually asked this question by one of my congregants. She's in the United States, and her company was instituting mandatory vaccines. And she asked me, well, see, I grew up being told that there was a prophetic tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that says there's no illness except death for which there is no cure. Okay. So the Quran has always, and the teachings of the Prophet have always inspired scientific inquiry within the Muslim context. It was the Quran's dictation of looking at nature and certain things in nature and the planets and its description of the planets and so on that inspired Muslim scientists. So this notion that there is a difference between science and Islam, or that Islam is antithetical to science or vice versa, is a foreign concept that I don't understand. Around January 6th, and what was happening in the United States, I saw a Trump support rally and somebody holding a sign saying faith over logic. And I laughed, but it's not funny because this is real. People actually think this, right? And whereas I was always taught in the Islamic tradition that aql, your intelligence, is God's greatest gift to you. So surely the exercise of your intelligence must be inherent to this gift, right? You don't get a present and keep it boxed up. You use your present. So coming back to the tradition, the reported tradition of the Prophet, that for every illness there is a cure. COVID is an illness. There has to be a cure for it. We just have to find it. Just like there has to be a cure for AIDS or for cancer or for everything else. Now, our own capacities and financial greed and all of that may interfere with us finding or marketing those cures, but surely if religion is about the wellness of our spirit, the wellness of our spirits are also tied to the wellness of our bodies, and one cannot be antithetical to the other. So I would say in the Muslim tradition, it would be a religious duty to seek a solution to any medical illness, including COVID. And that if that solution lies in a vaccine, as long as it is ethically tested, and it's safe, and it is halal in its production, I would say, yes, this is what you should be doing as a person of faith.
Yep, absolutely. So, El-Farouk, what would you say to younger LGBT Muslims coming out? What advice would you give?
Oh, that's a complex question. It depends where you are, right? And I mean, one of the things that has continued to happen, particularly because of COVID, is that our community, because it is also small and dispersed, we've become more and more of a global community, and people are connected to other queer Muslims in other parts of the world. But conditions in different parts of the world are also not the same. Coming out in let's say in Tanzania is not the same as coming out in downtown Toronto, and it's not the same as coming out, let's say, in Singapore. right? And I have folks in all of these places as part of my community. And I think the globalization also creates sometimes unrealistic expectations of coming out as well. And I always tell people, be safe first, right? So when Troy and I travel, when my husband and I travel to certain parts of the world, and we have to lie from the moment we land at the airport and go to different folks to get in, different visa officers to enter the country, and then have to lie at every point with people that we don't know as to what our relationship is. This must be suffocating and overbearing for people who, unlike me and Troy, don't have a flight back to somewhere where we can live normally and openly and freely and with dignity. So coming out can be dangerous for a lot of people. It can be dangerous for people even right here, depending on their economic and their social circumstance. So the first thing I tell folks is make sure that it is safe for you. And sometimes safety means that you have your own economic viability, that you're not economically dependent on other folks who may reject you or who may not support you after you come out. Sometimes I tell people to wait a little bit. What's the hurry? Right? Sometimes we have to come out to ourselves and fully embrace ourselves before we come out to others. Sometimes we can come out in my own experience, I came out in certain places. I didn't just sort of plop up on the scene, right? And I said to someone the other day that I didn't actually need to come out. They asked me once to be part of the National Coming Out Day, and I'm like, but I've already been outed in the media. Like, I'm talking about queer refugees. People have already assumed that I'm gay without me saying that I am, right? So there's different ways of coming out. And I always tell people, exercise your safety, make sure you have community. I think community is really important. Community can change hearts. My mom just received an award from the Canadian Council of Muslim Women as a woman who inspires. And part of the award is partially because of her work with the Unity Mosque in Toronto and in Vancouver, where she facilitates their weekly gatherings and is sort of like the elder of the community. And one of the things that she talked about at the ceremony was community. When she saw community around me, this was transformative for her, right? Because in the back of her mind was one of the fears for me was that I was going to be alone, that I was going to be on the margins of society, and to see people of all religious genders, orientations, and stuff around me in community was for her transformative. And I think it's not just transformative, but it is also potentially safety for a lot of people. So, do you need to come out? Do you have a safety net? Do you have a community or support network? I would say those are very important factors.
Neat. El-Farouk, I've often said that there are many paths to God. And Christianity is one of them. Islam is one of them. There are many paths to God. And if you think of a mountain, at the bottom of the mountain, we may be far apart. But when do we have the full view? It's only when our paths come together at the top. And it's been my experience of you over the years that you've helped me to expand my view of the face of God. You've helped me to see a more complete picture of what God could be like, because you've brought who you are in your religious tradition to me. And as we've shared, I have a bigger picture of what God would be like. And so, I want to thank you for that and for the courageous, amazing work that you're doing. And if people want to know more about your work, what's the contact information you'd like them to have?
We have a website, jumacircle.com. We also have an active Facebook group, the Unity Mosque. And I can be Googled. You can find me quite easily if you're looking for me. I'm around. We host, since the pandemic, the mosque has gone online, and we're hosting 3 Friday services in December, and they're actually going to be, I'm going to be giving one of the sermons, and it's my take on Jesus and Mary and John. And our services are open to everybody, Muslim or non-Muslim. So everybody is welcome. Find me if you're interested.
So thank you, my friend El-Farouk, for sharing your insights with us today. And If you found this interview helpful, we encourage you to subscribe to our channel. It's free and it really helps us. And don't forget to check out El-Farouk Khaki's links in the description below. El-Farouk, thank you.
Thank you, Brent.